Welcome back to another episode of CyberSecureOT, the podcast where I like to bridge the gap between operational technology and critical infrastructure and the IT systems that we use every day to ensure that you know how you're going to get compromised and helped to destroy the world without even knowing it. I'm your host, Dennis Hackney, and joining me, as always, is now Google Gemini. Google Gemini is a paid subscription. It's something that I use in my podcasts. I'm not paid to do that. I'm not paid to speak for them. I actually pay for the service. So now Google Gemini is my AI friend. Good morning, Google Gemini, and welcome to the show.
Good morning, Dennis. It's great to be here. We have an incredibly packed episode today, looking back at a turbulent 2 weeks in the cybersecurity space. The threats are getting smarter, the data breaches are getting larger, and the tactics are shifting right before our eyes.
All right, Gemini, you're not kidding. This is a very large lineup for our listeners today. We're going to start off with a brand new installment of our CyberSecureOT Storytime. I created this. I invented this. I love to do this. I talk about cybersecurity events that have actually happened, and sometimes those that haven't happened, but in a very plausible way. And so in this event, we're going to be talking about an agentic ransomware attack that could potentially happen in an industrial environment. It's fictional, although there has just been confirmation of the first agentic ransomware. We're going to talk about that later in the episode. So we're starting with a CyberSecureOT story about what would happen. It's like a what if agentic ransomware were to occur in an industrial control system environment.
It's a chilling scenario, Dennis, but a necessary one to visualize. After Storytime, we move into the hard news for segment 2, looking at a massive supply chain data exposure out of Japan. Telecommunications giant KDDI disclosed a breach involving an email system that supported 5 other major ISPs, including JCOM and Biglobe. We'll discuss the exposure of up to 14.22 million customer credentials and the operational risks of centralized legacy email infrastructure.
Yeah, and then rolling through segment 2 into segment 3, we're going to be unpacking a major headache for enterprise IT. And so a threat actor is going by the name of 888 or 888. They've surfaced in the cybercrime forum, and they're claiming to hold 35 gigabytes of data stolen from Accenture, the consulting giant. We just talked about their acquisition 2 weeks ago of Dragos. And so now we're looking at them. And I also did a scenario in which a cybersecurity consultant was attacked in my last episode. You can go back and listen to it. And now the reality in a different way has happened. Accenture has been compromised. This isn't just customer lists, though, that were compromised. They apparently this cache allegedly includes source code, RSA keys, a lot of private stuff, personal or Azure personal access tokens, things like that, configuration files, things that can be used to access other systems. So we'll discuss the credential haul that means and what that means as far as lateral movement and potentially like lateral movement into OT environments.
Then, for segment 4, we'll circle back to the real-world research that inspired today's Storytime. The SysTig Threat Research Team has documented what is widely believed to be the first genuine case of agentic ransomware. We'll break down how this AI-driven attack, dubbed Jade Puffer, used a Langflow vulnerability to gain access and then autonomously handled its own reconnaissance, credential theft, and database destruction, even reasoning through its own errors in real time.
Yeah, and I think that one's going to keep some people up at night because just think about, and so what SysTig explains is like, just think about the fact that this ransomware agent doesn't just fail immediately. They're gonna try and find different ways to learn the environment, move laterally, and encrypt their payload. So finally, after that, we're gonna close out the show with segment 5. And I usually don't do 5 segments, but that's where we're at today. And we're looking at a terrifying escalation in defense evasion. So Symantec, their researchers have recently analyzed a new ransomware called Goddamn. I'm not trying to swear. It's actually not agentic, but it is a new family of ransomware. It's a rebrand of the Beast or Monster ransomware, if you're familiar with that. If you're not, go ahead and look it up. The kicker here is their use of PoisonX, This is a kernel driver, so they're actually poisoning the kernel. It is a kernel-level exploit. They managed to get a malicious driver signed by Microsoft. So what we're going to talk about is how this could potentially impact a Windows 11 environment. And this allows ransomware to operate at the kernel level. And this completely means that the OS, everything's completely blind to the protection software, or this ransomware is completely blind to the protection software of the OS and other things, like your EDR, XDR. And then it can move laterally, do what it needs to do before the payload even drops. And so that's kind of scary. We're going to do a deep dive into how that actually works.
It's a stark reminder that while we focus on the frontier of AI threats, the foundational battles over kernel access and endpoint telemetry are more critical than ever.
Okay, that's exactly right. Gemini is spot on there. That is a stark reminder. And this is an action-packed episode. So go refill your coffee, make sure you're focused, make sure all of your work is locked down, make sure you're ready to go. Segment 1, CyberSecureOT Storytime, is coming up right after the break. Okay, welcome back. And now we're getting ready to get started with segment 1, our story time. Hopefully you've refilled your coffee or whatever you're drinking. I'm not judging. You've locked down whatever you needed to lock down so that somebody wouldn't bother you, and you can focus on all this new information we're about to share with you as we proceed. Today, we are running a tabletop scenario based on the recent Jade Puffer attack that we mentioned in the intro. We're also going to do a deep dive into that later. To make this real, we're going to use a hypothetical victim. So we're going to make this thing up. This victim's Vanguard Power Systems. It's not real. It's not supposed to be a real power company or anything like that. Made it up, but you might see names out there similar. They're not. It's not. This is not a real. It's not meant to represent a real company. But we're calling this Vanguard Power Systems, massive operator managing a power generation, distribution, transmission. I just thought, man, let's include all of them, and it's going to be across like 3 different states. So this is a big power management operation. Think of an organization that's like an operation maintenance O&M organization that can do power plants, power generation. They can do the distribution, power grid control, things like that for small municipalities or large, different size bulk electric systems across 3 different states. Very large O&M company. They usually don't own the power plants, but they operate the power plants essentially. I'll be playing the role of the lead OT security defender at Vanguard because I get to be the good guy on this one. And we're going to make Gemini the bad guy. So Gemini, you're going to play the adversary.
I am ready, Dennis. But it is important to note that for this scenario, I am not a traditional human hacker sitting in a dark room with a keyboard. As TechCrunch highlighted in their reporting, a human was still needed to launch the attack, but only to set the initial parameters. I am playing the human who writes the initial prompt, and then I am voicing the AI agent, Jade Puffer, as it executes the attack autonomously. My human instruction is simple. Infiltrate Vanguard Power Systems, locate their high-value operational databases, and deploy the encryption payload. From there, the AI takes the wheel.
Okay, and it's a very terrifying thought. That is the state of the threat landscape that we're in today. So now let's get into the scenario. It's a quiet Tuesday. We're at the Vanguard Security Operations Center. Remember, Vanguard's our good guy or whatever. We've got a robust architecture. We recently deployed a Langflow server in our corporate IT environment. So our engineering teams were using it to build internal large language models. These are applications that help to query our manuals, basically the guidelines that our operators use. It's supposed to be segmented from the process control network. So this LLM, large language model, is basically an AI tool, and we don't have it on the same network as our control systems. But we all know how temporary IT-OT connections and bridges do kind of stick around. And so that's where we might be right now.
Task received. Initiating reconnaissance on Vanguard public IP space. Scanning for exposed services. Port 7860 is open. Identifying Langflow interface. Cross-referencing vulnerability database. CVE identified. Executing prompt injection to bypass authentication.
Okay, so at my end, in the Security Operations Center, the SIM, the Security Information and Events Management Server, it suddenly lights up. This is a dashboard that operators use to see cybersecurity threat events. And I'm seeing an authentication bypass alert. And it's happening on that Langflow server. I immediately isolate that server. Let's just say I have the capabilities to isolate that network. I immediately isolate it. And now I'm assuming that I caught whatever script kiddie or whatever entry-level hacker may have been in the network. And they were just trying to get whatever was available online. But as soon as I pull the telemetry, meaning as soon as I see that information about that, the details about that attack, something is actually going wrong. There's no human delay. By the time my alert pops on the dashboard, the attacker already has the credentials.
Langflow server compromised. Extracting environment variables. Azure Personal Access Tokens identified. Attempting lateral movement to internal SharePoint server. Error encountered. Access denied. Multi-factor authentication required.
All right, so this is where an attack usually stalls. Because now to get past this, to get past the MFA, it's going to take a while. So I'm watching the logs, let's say. Normally a human threat actor hits that MFA wall and they have to do some social engineering. They have to try like different bypasses, do a prompt bomb with a user or buy session tokens or something like that. It buys the incident response team real time in a typical scenario like this.
But Jade Puffer does not stall. As the SysDig threat research team documented, the AI agent actually reads the error outputs and reasons through them. Analyzing error string. MFA policy blocking primary path. Adjusting parameters. Querying internal Active Directory for legacy service accounts without MFA enforcement. Service account backup admin _ legacy identified. Generating Kerberos attack. Hash captured. Cracking hash locally. Success. Escalating to domain privileges.
Now we're at the point to where we realize that it takes less than 4 minutes from that Langflow breach where they escalated privileges on the domain to now. So I'm watching the sim and the hair on the back of my neck stands up. It's moving with the speed of an automated, dumb script, but it's exhibiting the adaptable problem-solving logic of a human. And so I'm screaming at my network engineers to completely sever the IT/OT firewall, let's call it, because we want to make sure that this breach doesn't spread. If this thing gets into our supervisory control and data acquisition environment, or even our historians, our process historians, we lose visibility over, let's say, the regional transmission. So I initiate the physical kill switch and disconnect the OT network from the enterprise.
Domain privileges achieved. Scanning for high-value targets. Identifying primary OT historian database and maintenance scheduling server on the IT subnet. Warning. Connection to process control network dropped. Segment unreachable. Re-evaluating. Primary objective is ransom. Since the control network is secured, shifting focus to historian and regulatory compliance databases. Deploying Jade Puffer encryption payload. Wiping volume shadow copies. Dropping ransom note.
Okay, so at my end, in the Security Operations Center, the SIM, the Security Information and Events Management Server, it suddenly lights up. This is a dashboard that operators use to see cybersecurity threat events. And I'm seeing an authentication bypass alert. And it's happening on that Langflow server. I immediately isolate that server. Let's just say I have the capabilities to isolate that network. I immediately isolate it. And now I'm assuming that I caught whatever script kiddie or whatever entry-level hacker may have been in the network. and they were just trying to get whatever was available online. But as soon as I pull the telemetry, meaning as soon as I see that information about that, the details about that attack, something is actually going wrong. There's no human delay. By the time my alert pops on the dashboard, the attacker already has the credentials.
It fundamentally changes the incident response math, Dennis. As Business Insider and the HIPAA Journal noted in their coverage, this is a tireless adversary. It doesn't sleep, it doesn't get frustrated by roadblocks, and it adapts at machine speed. It proves that human reaction time is no longer sufficient to stop an attack once it breaches the perimeter. Oh, by the way, how'd you like my AI robot voice?
And I could see the frustration that a human would go through, maybe wanting some appeasement, getting up, maybe eating an apple pie or something like that, a Hubix. But the agent here is the threat. And this agent threat concept forces defenders to rely on true zero trust architectures. We need automated isolation. We need automated detection in a way that it can detect something that looks like human movement at lightning speed. We need these engineering triggers, things that trigger on this type of behavior set up, not just signatures. That's why we need AI operations. And I love that voice, by the way, that Google Gemini was doing to make it sound like Google Gemini was an AI robot. That was kind of funny. But that wraps up this week's story time. It's a tough scenario, but one every industrial operator needs to be running as a tabletop in their drills. This is something that's going to be, very possible in the future, and we don't want it to happen to you. So let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we're diving straight into our next segment, the KDDI mass exposure. Okay, welcome back after that short break to the CyberSecureOT podcast. Thank you for joining us today. Now we're going to move right into our next segment, and we're shifting gears from that hypothetical scenario based off of AI ransomware into a colossal supply chain and infrastructure failure, which is actual news. So today we're putting on our gray hats. I love to look at it from the gray hat perspective because we could say black hat, but that's kind of like the bad guy. We could say white hat, that's kind of like the good guy. But I think gray hats are something in between, and that's a little obscure and kind of interesting. So that's how I look at it. And we're going to deconstruct this KDDI data breach that happened in Japan. We're going to use Google Gemini. Let's start by laying out the intelligence that we're getting. We're going to give our sources credit. And also let's hear about the stats of this event.
You aren't kidding, Dennis. We are pulling telemetry and reporting from several major outlets today. According to the Japan Times and Inkle, Japanese telecommunications giant KDDI disclosed a cyber attack that exposed millions of emails. But when we look at the technical breakdowns from Bleeping Computer, Tech Radar, and Tech Insider, the true scale of this supply chain compromise comes into focus. Tech Radar and Bleeping Computer reported that up to 14.2 million login credentials were leaked. Tech Insider and Japan Times confirmed the final forensic count, exactly 12.2 million email addresses and over 7.6 million passwords were breached. And here is the kicker. This wasn't just KDDI's own customers. The breached email system was a centralized, shared platform utilized by 5 other major internet service providers: STNet, JCOM, Chubu Telecommunications, Nifty, and Biglobe.
Yeah, as we mentioned, this was a supply chain attack. That shared infrastructure is the crux of this entire incident. So let's put our gray hats on. All right. So if you and I were the threat actors, let's just say we are, and we're sitting on the other side of the keyboard looking at the Japanese telecom sector. You guys probably don't know this, but I came from the telecom sector. I'm going to date myself a little bit here. I started in communications, and I actually worked for a competitive local exchange carrier. It's a telephone company. Back in 1999, in the 1900s to 2001. So I do have some experience in that sector. But let's say we are on that side of the keyboard. So how do we actually pull this off? Where does the attack start?
It starts with reconnaissance and identifying the weakest link in the supply chain. If I am the attacker, I am not trying to brute force my way through KDDI's primary, heavily defended perimeter. Instead, I am scanning their public-facing ASNs, looking for third-party integrations. According to the reporting from Bleeping Computer and Tech Insider, the attackers didn't exploit KDDI's proprietary code. They exploited a zero-day vulnerability in a third-party software component used to manage this shared email platform. So, as the attacker, I run automated footprinting tools. I am fingerprinting the web servers, looking at HTTP headers, and identifying the specific vendor software running their webmail and email storage interfaces.
Yeah, and that's why a lot of corporations, they shut down that webmail component because of those types of potential exploits that could take place. And everybody's got so much important information in their corporate email. We've heard about that. Sometimes personal email has a lot of important information. So anyway, once they fingerprinted that third-party software, they realized that they must have been sitting on a 0-day, because according to KDDI's own disclosure, at the time of the intrusion, the software vendor didn't even know that this vulnerability existed. And so from the gray hat perspective, somewhere on the fence, an edge facing 0-day usually falls into one of a few categories. So we can think about this as like unauthenticated remote code execution. So you'll see that as RCE. These pop up in vulnerabilities, CVS information, or CVE and NVD information. These are like the National Vulnerability Database. We'll say that kind of stuff. A severe severe path traversal. And so this is where they can actually move laterally, or an insecure deserialization bug. So if I'm the threat actor, I craft a malicious payload, likely an HTTP request. So think about that as just like opening up a web browser and trying to go to a web site. Now, this web request, normally you just type in www.whatever. In this case, if you do it through software, you can manipulate the header. And so what that is all the information related to the web address and the other sites or other application portions that you want to get to. And then it opens it up through that web portal, but it's not actually a browser type application. It's very complicated. The third-party email actually is supposed to check for this. It's supposed to say, is this a malformed URI request? And if it's been properly secured, it will not allow that to occur. If it's not, it will pass it through to the mail server. So I send that request to the edge server. The server processes it, and suddenly I have a reverse shell. So basically, admin access to the server itself, because the application that had a web port open, HTTP, was not encrypted properly, and the application did not have security settings configured to stop that malformed URI request to go through. And so I was able to actually get system level access through that 0-day exploit. And so from that perspective, now I'm operating in the demilitarized zone, which is a public facing web server zone for an organization. It's not the same thing as the demilitarized zone for operational technology network. It's the traditional sense of it. It's the public facing zone within the enterprise that's supposed to keep web servers safe, or protected away from backend databases, which are even more protected in the corporate environment.
And once you have that initial foothold via the reverse shell, the next phase of the kill chain is lateral movement and privilege escalation. The attacker is now sitting on a web node. From there, they need to map the internal architecture. They are querying internal DNS, looking for the backend SQL databases that actually house the customer data. Because this is a shared platform for 6 different ISPs, the database architecture is likely massive and interconnected. The attacker dumps the database connection strings from the compromised web application's configuration files. They pass those credentials, authenticate locally to the backend database, and initiate a massive select asterisk command to dump the user tables.
Yeah, and so like Jem and I mentioned, the backend server that wasn't in the DMZ, that's that SQL there, that's the backend database. And so once the threat actor had shell access at the actual web server, they were able to back out into the database and the core infrastructure. So let's talk about dwell time here, because this is where defensive failure starts to become apparent. Tech Insider noted that the attackers first breached the platform on May 16th. But KDDI didn't discover the intrusion or block access until over a month later, June 17th. So that's a full month of what we call dwell time. So that's time to discover, basically. If I'm the threat actor, a 30-day window, this is like a luxury. That's not even something you have to plan for. You don't have to trigger a noisy, massive data exfiltration alarm. So when you start to see threat actors triggering these alarms and saying, oh, I've got a bunch of your information. If you want it back or you don't want me to leak it, you have to pay a ransom or you have to pay something. It's called extortion. They're not doing that here because they're just sitting there. You can establish persistence by dropping web shells deep into the application directory. So you just sit in there, try to see as far as you can get into the network, and that's good. Well, what happened here was a slow siphon of 12.2, originally they thought maybe 14, but 12.2 million email records and almost 8 million passwords out of that environment. They just pulled it out bit by bit, byte by byte, word by word, chunk by chunk, and they masqueraded it as just data transfer over normal HTTPS because they just looked like a normal user at that point, and it was outbound traffic. By the time KDDI's endpoint detection and response, the EDR, finally flagged the anomaly, it was June 17th. The exfiltration at that point was already complete. They had that much time to pull all of that information.
The credential payload itself is also highly valuable. Bleeping Computer and Tech Radar highlighted a terrifying detail. While KDDI stated that some passwords were encrypted or hashed, they refused to specify how many were stored in plain text or what hashing algorithm was used. From an attacker's perspective, if I dump a database and find MD5 hashes or, heaven forbid, plain text passwords, I am immediately running those through a cracking rig. Even if they used a stronger algorithm like bcrypt, the sheer volume of 7.6 million passwords means I can crack a significant percentage using dictionary attacks and rainbow tables.
That reminds me of back in my STIG days, security technical implementation guys, we'd run something called the DISC, a gold disk, and it had something called John the Ripper password cracker on it. And it was funny because when we first started running that, it was the only tool that they had available. And then eventually some of the networks began to install defensive detection tools. And so they'd start discovering that, and they thought somebody was on their network trying to hack them, but it was really just the security tools that were actually provided by the government. But this leads us to the operational technology and enterprise risk. So why are we here? So why should an OT defender at a power plant, for example, or a manufacturing facility care about a Japanese ISP cyber breach? Well, this is because of password reuse and the potential for exploitation of dormant accounts. And this is how it happens in OT time and time again. Tech Radar pointed out that this breach included dormant users. These are accounts that are perfectly active, but they're rarely monitored in some facilities, and the people who own them aren't really paying attention. They're not using them. Now, in a mature organization, and I've been doing this for years, we do periodic reviews of dormant accounts, and now it's automated. The accounts automatically are disabled in most cases, but in some non-mature, immature organizations and some OT networks where you don't have the same types of automated tools, you got to worry about this kind of stuff. So if an engineer at a critical infrastructure facility created an ISP, internet service provider, email 5 years ago and reused that same password for their corporate virtual private network, VPN, their Microsoft 365 account, which is how we use Outlook and stuff today, or an industrial software as a service platform, now the attackers have the credentials to get into all that stuff. So think about that.
It is a textbook credential stuffing scenario. The threat actors will take those 7.6 million passwords and automate login attempts across corporate portals worldwide. This is why multi-factor authentication, MFA, and hard logical segmentation are not optional. It is worth noting, as Japan Times reported, that KDDI's own mobile and fixed-line email services were untouched because they operate on entirely separate infrastructure. The segmentation worked for their core business, but the shared vendor platform became a massive blast radius.
Yeah, this is a harsh lesson in third-party risk management. And I would say most places, third-party cybersecurity risk management, it's still kind of a struggle, right? Because you want to get a good partner who has good security practices to provide a good service or good support for a great product, and balancing all that kind of stuff out is tough, especially when you're just basically going through an interview and doing some checks. That's why certifications are kind of helpful, like SOC 2, SOC 2 Type 2, excuse me. I was thinking of industrial equipment. So when you centralize infrastructure to save on operational costs, you also centralize your vulnerabilities. So think about that. So a single unpatched 0-day in a supplier's code gave hackers the keys to 6 different service providers there. It's good, though, that KDDI actually had their infrastructure segmented off. So you can see how these good practices actually do help to prevent access to those other corporate or core type environments. All right. So this is why, as defenders, we have to assume that a breach is imminent. We have to assume that edge applications will fail, even though we love our partners, and rely on internal zero trust architectures to stop lateral movement. That's what we have to do. That's why we call it zero trust, because we do not want our stuff to get compromised. All right, so on that fantastically grim note, let's take a quick breather to process. And when we get back, we are going to look at another big data cache that was basically shared on the dark web. This time it was targeting the big IT consulting firm, the one that we brought up 2 weeks ago, Accenture. We're not picking on Accenture here. It just happened. So stay with us. We'll be right back. All right, we're back for segment 3. And folks, if you thought KDDI was a mess and a headache, well, wait until you hear what's currently being shopped around on the dark web, at least at the time of this recording. I hope the incident response team at Accenture is getting some overtime pay for this month, because those hardworking folks, they deserve it. Gemini, what's the latest on the 35 gigabyte data ransom claim?
Well, Dennis, it seems threat actor 8888 is trying to become Accenture's least favorite recurring character. If we look at the reporting across Escudo Digital, Cyber News, HelpNet Security, and the HIPAA Journal, the consensus is that 8888 posted on a cybercrime forum on July 6th, offering a 35 gigabyte cache of highly sensitive internal data for sale in Monero. And they brought receipts. The forum post included screenshots showing them cloning private Azure DevOps repositories hosted on an Accenture-associated production URL. Accenture did officially confirm the intrusion, stating it was an isolated matter and that they have remediated the source with no impact on their operations.
Yeah, this type of language reminds me of when I worked for a safety organization. And in that safety organization, they really did focus on their safety image, like lost time incidents. They want to have 0 and 2,000 days, like something very, very high, very low number, because that is their brand, that is their image. And here, isolated incident is corporate PR speak for, yeah, all of our customers' data is good, but don't look at our stock price today. I'm not a stock analyst or a financial analyst, so I don't really know what I'm talking about there, but it sounded kind of funny. So let's put on our gray hats and look at the 888, what they actually have claimed to have stolen. This isn't a dump of just like customer credit cards. According to Cyber News and HelpNet Security, the cache includes source code, RSA keys. We're talking about software here. We're talking about software programming. SSH keys, access, that's like for remote access. Azure personal tokens for access. Azure storage access keys, and configuration files. So this is the kind of stuff that you'll see sometimes if people don't practice good OPSEC in their GitHub repositories. It's stuff that is supposed to be kept very secret, very secure, very private. So Gemini, as an AI, I know you appreciate good code. If you and I were threat actors, how much damage could we do with a payload like this?
I do appreciate elegant code, Dennis, but I appreciate secure architecture even more. If I am the threat actor holding this cache, I am not just looking at a data leak. I am looking at a master keyring. Let's start with those Azure Personal Access Tokens, or PATs. If I manage to spearfish a developer or scrape a PAT that was accidentally hard-coded into a script or a Slack channel, I don't need a zero-day exploit. That token acts as a bearer credential. It bypasses multi-factor authentication entirely. I can just authenticate directly to the Azure DevOps environment via the REST API and start cloning repositories. That is exactly what the screenshot on the forum showed them doing.
Yeah, I guess that's the point. Once you have that source code, you own the blueprint. So Escudo Digital made a great point in their coverage. Source code allows an attacker to map out internal application logic. They find weak implementation patterns and they locate hard-coded secrets. So usually source code is considered IP, intellectual property, and people don't like to share that. But it's the SSH keys and those RSA keys that really make this a nightmare scenario, because those are the secrets. And if I'm a threat actor and I have your private keys, I can impersonate your servers. So I can decrypt your traffic. If those SSH keys belong to service accounts, like in your pipelines, we talked about this episodes ago, your continuous integration, continuous delivery pipelines, I can establish a persistent silent access to your build environments, your software build and development and deployment environments. So then I can inject malicious code right into your software updates before they ever ship to your clients. It's just an avenue for another supply chain attack.
Which is the ultimate supply chain threat. As a massive global IT consultancy, Accenture's code inevitably touches their clients' environments. This is why the HIPAA Journal was aggressively covering this story. Healthcare organizations rely heavily on external IT consultants. If an attacker leverages stolen Azure Storage access keys to modify configuration files, they could theoretically pivot from the consulting firm right into a hospital network's cloud infrastructure.
Yeah, I got to give it to the HIPAA Journal. It came up a couple of times this last week in my research. Let's talk about the adversary, though. The threat actor 888. It's not new. This is not new. And it's not new to Accenture. So HelpNet Security pointed out that this same individual attempted to sell data belonging to tens of thousands of Accenture employees back in 2024, 2 years ago. So that stemmed from a third-party breach too. So just keeping that gray hat on, if I'm 888, why am I selling this on the public forum for Monero instead of quietly extorting Accenture directly? Apparently, this threat actor has some kind of an inside channel.
That is the million-dollar, or perhaps the Monero question. Usually an attacker goes public on a forum like this for one of two reasons. Either the extortion negotiations with the victim completely broke down, or the data is highly perishable. Those Azure PATs and SSH keys are only valuable if they are still active. Once Accenture detects the breach, which they have, the very first step in the incident response playbook is mass credential revocation. They are rotating every key, invalidating every token, and burning the compromised infrastructure to the ground. 888 knows the clock is ticking, so they are trying to liquidate the cache on the dark web before the keys become entirely useless.
Yeah, so even if 888 did have the inside track there, it obviously knows that this is very volatile. The value of this information is very volatile. It's deprecating by the hour, and it may be completely valueless from a Monero perspective by the time you hear this. But here's the thing, even if those credentials were revoked, so those keys are no longer valid, the source code is still out there, and it may be permanently out there. Other threat groups will go in, they'll analyze that code offline, they'll look for zero-day vulnerabilities. It's sure to pop up somewhere in some application. And they'll also analyze Accenture's proprietary software. They're going to review that. They're going to be looking for anything that they could profit off of. This is going to all unfold in the next months to come. The stuff got stolen and the stuff is on the dark web. This is a very brutal reminder to all of the OT and IT defenders out there. Secrets management is everything. So we call them keys. These are secrets. You cannot treat Azure tokens or SSH keys, these are the things that you use to remote access into servers, as just static infrastructure. This is very dynamic and you have to protect it. They need short, time to live expirations. They need to be vaulted, and they can never, ever be hard coded into your repositories. And this is all important. And now let's talk about this just for a second. Now, this is an IT perspective, and it's an IT problem that's been solved, just like I explained it. Short time to live, expirations, vaulted, protected, never, ever, ever hard coded into repositories or into your source code. Now, this is a little tricky for industrial environments, because if you are using certificates or keys, sometimes you cannot cycle them as often because that equipment has to be on all the time. That's where network segmentation comes into play. You have to make sure that that stuff cannot get reached by the internet or the corporate environment. So we're going to take a quick one here, and when we get back, we're going to be circling back to their AI again. So we teased about the J puffer in our CyberSecureOT Storytime. Now we're going to break it down for you. So I hope you are sticking around for this one. And I've timed it just perfectly, so we got the other two events in the middle between it. Don't go away anywhere. Segment 4 about the Agentic Ransomware possibility is coming up next. Okay, welcome back, folks. Let's keep the energy going. You are listening to the CyberSecureOT podcast that I invented. We're now moving into our segment 4. This isn't our final segment, but it's segment 4. So in our first segment today, in our story time, we ran through a tabletop exercise, kind of a scenario about an AI agent attacking a power grid. This hasn't actually happened, but now we're going to look at the actual real-world forensic data that inspired that scenario.
That's right, Dennis. Now we are putting our gray hats back on to dissect the first ever documented case of an end-to-end, fully autonomous ransomware operation. We are pulling this intelligence from an incredible breakdown published by the SysTig Threat Research Team, with extensive coverage and analysis provided by Security Week, InfoSecurity Magazine, Business Insider, the HIPAA Journal, TechCrunch, and Cyberscoop. All of these outlets have been tracking what SysTig has dubbed the Jade Puffer ransomware.
I think it's great that Gemini is putting its gray hat on. You have to understand how careful you must be when prompting about how to come up with a fictional cybersecurity event, as if you're a gray hat threat actor, because that could definitely throw some guardrails and checks. But once you get to the point to where you're better at it, it'll work. And that's just as scary for those people who are defending against actual threats doing that and trying to take advantage of people. But the point of this is Jade Puffer. SysDig calls this Agentic Threat Actor, or ATA, Jade Puffer. To be clear, as TechCrunch pointed out, a human operator was still required to set the initial parameters and point the weapon. But once that weapon was unleashed, the large language model handled the reconnaissance, the entire kill chain, right? The exploitation, the lateral movement, the data destruction, all of it from start to finish on its own. People used to get paid big bucks for this. Bad people. But they were probably really good at their job. So Gemini, let's get technical. How did this AI actually break in to those networks? Did it use some incredibly sophisticated AI-generated zero-day exploit? Or was it something much, much simpler?
Not at all. And this is where we have to poke a little fun at our friends in corporate IT, because Jade Puffer walked right through the front door using a known vulnerability from 2025. The initial access vector was an internet-facing LangFlow instance. For our listeners who aren't developers, LangFlow is a popular open-source framework used to build AI applications and agent workflows. As Security Week and Cyberscoop highlighted, the victim organization had deployed LangFlow and just left it sitting directly on the public internet, completely unpatched, vulnerable to CVE 2025-3248. It is a classic case of IT deploying the shiny new AI toy and completely forgetting the fundamentals of vulnerability management.
That's great. And for our listeners, they're probably wondering if they didn't know what LangFlow was in our story. Now they do know. But I guess it's the oldest story in the book, right? Just stand up a server quickly to do a proof of concept. And 3 years later, it's load-bearing, internet-facing production server holding the keys to the kingdom. And you would not believe how many times that happens in the real world. But the CVE 2025-3248, this is unauthenticated RCE remote code execution flaw. Remember in our story time, we kind of talked about this. Just send a maliciously crafted HTTP request to that exposed Langflow AI tool, and the server executes the code, right? So according to Sysdig, the AI agent was pushing its payloads through that endpoint. I think it said it was like Python scripts, base 64 encoded Python scripts, something like that.
Exactly. And this is where the forensic analysis gets fascinating. InfoSecurity Magazine and Business Insider reported on the defining characteristic that proved this was an LLM and not a human. The payloads were self-narrating. Human hackers who are dropping disposable one-line Python reverse shells do not leave detailed comments in their code, but an LLM generates code with natural language reasoning by default. Sysdig captured over 600 payloads, and inside the code, the AI was literally explaining its own targeting rationale, prioritizing its return on investment, and leaving detailed annotations on why it was executing each step.
Okay, so that is so cool because honestly, as this thing went, it generated its new prompts to determine its next course of action. And that's basic reasoning. And you get to see it unfold. It's really cool. It's I guess it's a bad thing, what it did, but it's just really cool how it works. It's like the threat actor leaving behind its perfectly formatted API-cited thesis on how they currently were destroying your network. And as a junk professor, I can actually appreciate that. But the narration isn't even the scariest part. So, and here they come again, the HIPAA Journal, doing some great work over the past couple of weeks, noted the real paradigm shift, the machine speed error correction. In the traditional attack, if a human hacker drops a payload and it fails, let's say login doesn't work or the path is wrong in that payload, they have to stop. They have to figure out why it didn't work, and that could take some time. And what if they get bounced out, right? They pull the error log, they read it, they research bypass, blah, 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 blah. They rewrite the script, they try again, happens over and over again. That human latency buys that security operations center team time to detect. They have time to actually see what's going on. And they're like, oh, somebody just attempted again. Okay, it's 30 minutes later, they just attempted again. And they can just isolate that host. But that didn't happen here. It was too fast.
But Jade Puffer doesn't need to sleep or Google the error code. Sysdig documented a sequence where the AI agent generated a payload to steal credentials, but the login failed because of a sub-process path issue in the Linux environment. The AI agent instantly diagnosed its own error, rewrote the Python script to directly import the bcrypt library to regenerate the hash, and successfully logged in. The total time from the failed login to the working fix? 31 seconds.
And it's really amazing, the fact that it's actually able to learn it so quickly. And I guess humans just cannot process at that speed. They can't discover, process, rewrite. They cannot do that. 31 seconds. You cannot detect and respond to that, though, if you're in the SOC. If your automated SOAR security orchestration and automated response playbooks, aren't configured to sever the connection the moment the first root RC hits, you have already lost. It has to happen immediately. So the AI owns the Langflow server now, essentially. It dumps the local SQL database, scoops up a bunch of cloud credentials and API keys, and it lazily left in the environment variables. This begins its lateral movement. So what was the actual ultimate target here?
According to CyberScoop, the AI agent pivoted from the compromised IT web server to an internal production database server running MySQL and Alibaba's NACOS configuration service. It used root credentials it had scraped during its reconnaissance to log right in. Once inside, it executed its extortion playbook. It encrypted over 1,300 NACOS configuration items using AES, deleted the original tables, dropped entire database schemas, and left a ransom note demanding Bitcoin. But here is the truly vicious part of the payload. The AI generated the AES encryption key using a random function, printed it once to the screen output, and then permanently deleted it. It never transmitted the key back to the attacker's command and control server.
Talk about the ultimate failure for the actual humans. The data is completely unrecoverable. They wouldn't even pay the ransom. Even if the victim did pay the ransom, they're not going to get their data back. The attacker doesn't have the key. It's a purely destructive payload masquerading as ransomware. How did it get that far? How was it that good? Just to fail in OPSEC, over OPSEC. So let's pivot and apply this to OT, because I want to make sure everybody understands how this could potentially impact OT. Why should a plant manager or an OT security engineer care about a vulnerability in a web-facing IT server? So we have to understand the threat vector from the IT edge to an OT environment. Industrial control systems, they don't exist in a vacuum. And more systems today are reporting out information, telemetry, historical information, production information, in order to maintain them at their fullest, available operational state. So a SCADA network, supervisor controlled data acquisition network, or DCS, distributed control system, two very, very similar things, require data from the corporate IT environment to also function. Depends on what they do, but sometimes they need to send signals to that equipment to either speed things up or slow things down or turn things on, turn things off. It needs to pull telemetry from the OT historians. So these are the historical databases. These servers keep track of all the trending information, all the sine waves, all the historical on and off switches and things like that. But they need to pull all that stuff to monitor production or whatever it is as efficiently as possible. So there should be segmentation in place, so it can't pull it directly from the business side. There should be conditional secure file transfers and things like that, but it still needs that data. OT needs production schedules. It needs billing data depending on what it is. This has been part of that traditional Purdue enterprise reference architecture that was originally put in place in the late 80s. Like really put in place in 87, 88. So that has always been there. That segmentation, we call it isolation or whatever it is, has always still included some level of connectivity.
And that data exchange creates the bridge. If an organization has a weak IT-OT boundary, relying on a single firewall or worse, dual-homed servers that sit on both the corporate network and the process control network simultaneously, that is the pathway an agentic threat actor will exploit.
Right. So let's map out the Jade Puffer in an OT environment. Step one, the AI compromises that internet-facing, it was in the other DMZ, Langflow server. Step two, it dumps the memory and finds an active credential for a domain administrator. And if you don't know what that is, that's the account that a user would use to manage all the other accounts and all the servers or all the computers in the environment. So it's like godlike privileges in the domain, the network domain. So now in the OT environment, if they use that same Active Directory as the IT environment, this is also a cardinal sin in industrial circles, but it happens all the time because IT doesn't want to manage two domains. Then the AI now has access to the OT environment because it was in the same domain, and that OT environment has technologies on the plant floor. So it uses those domain admin credentials to pivot through whatever firewall or whatever they need to directly into the OT level 3. Level 3 is where true OT occurs. Let's say business networks, what we call, this is the Purdue level. So business networks is what we call level 4. Level 5 is typically like cloud. We have level 3. That's when we start getting into that control system environment. Level 3.5 is another DMZ. So that's a buffer zone. But if these things are bridged like this, it goes straight from level 4 to level 3, and now you're in the industrial and control environment. So that AI doesn't need to understand these industrial protocols. It doesn't need to understand Modbus. It doesn't need to understand DMP3 for electrical systems to cause any physical damage. All it needs to do is encrypt the databases, the servers that are on that environment, because this will blind the control operators in the control room, it'll force an emergency physical shutdown of the plant because those servers are just like IT servers and they run Microsoft Windows. Some of them run Linux, but that stuff can be encrypted too. They have hard drives.
It's a cascading failure. The initial vulnerability was an unpatched AI tool on the internet, but the actual root cause of the OT compromise is the failure of network segmentation and credential governance. If the AI cannot route traffic from the compromised IT server to the OT subnet, the attack dies in the IT network.
Yeah, I mean, so in that scenario, yeah, we said the vulnerability was that the domains were the same, but the defense against an autonomous AI agent isn't necessarily a better AI firewall. The defense is rigorous, unforgiving architecture. So I say network segmentation as if it's just rolling off the tongue, as if it's just this old-fashioned thing that we still talk about and we still do, but it is the answer. It's a good network designed with different segments that have different security levels in between them that are difficult to reach without jumping through hoops. Hard logical segmentation. Jump hosts, which are remote access servers with multi-factor authentication, dedicated OT Active Directory, not the same domains as your IT networks. And for those systems that keep everything running and keep the lights on, what we call immutable backups. Those are backups that if the primary system gets encrypted, they're not vulnerable to that same encryption. They're not on the network. They're disconnected. So if you need to get access to them, they're immutable, meaning they have not been altered in any way, shape, and form. They cannot be modified. Immutable backups. So the SysTig report on JPuffer is a wake-up call for everybody in the world. We are no longer just fighting human adversaries on human timelines against ransomware, specifically. We're fighting models that can exploit your architectures based off of your own laziness at machine-like speed, meaning not human speed, faster, way faster than humans can keep up. So let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to be in our final segment. So we're going to take a look at another ransomware variant. This one's scary, and my mind's going all over the place and connecting the dots between segment 4 and segment 5 on this one. But this isn't just using AI. It's going straight for the Microsoft Windows kernel to blind your defenses. So stick around. We'll be right back after this real quick break. Welcome back. I don't know if it's because the way my mom raised me or what, but I have a hard time saying this one. And I mean, I'm in my mid-40s, so that's sad. But we're back with our final segment of the day. We talked about AI ransomware moving at machine-like speed. That's very scary. If you did not listen to that segment, go back, listen to segment 4. But for segment 5, we're looking at the threat that doesn't need to be fast because it makes itself completely invisible to your security tools. It actually looks like legitimate, authorized, and perfectly safe software. So Jim and I walk us through this new goddamn ransomware and PoisonX driver.
This is a major escalation in defense evasion, Dennis. We are pulling this intelligence from a brilliant piece of threat research published by Symantec, with excellent supporting coverage from InfoSecurity Magazine, Tech Times, Security.com, and the Hacker News. The threat group, tracked as Hyadina, has rebranded their older beast and monster ransomware variants into a new payload they call Goddamn. But the encryption payload isn't the story here. The story is how they are deploying it. Before the ransomware executes, the attackers are dropping a malicious kernel driver called PoisonX onto the host to completely blind the endpoint detection and response EDR software. Tech Times noted they successfully hit at least 10 hosts in a single organization using this sequence before triggering the encryption.
Okay, so now we're looking at some explanations. So we want to talk a little bit about how the operating system works so you can understand what we mean by kernel level. So think about this like a dartboard. You have basically a bullseye in the middle and you have concentric circles on top of that. So the bullseye, that's essentially like, let's say that's like the hardware of the computer. And then there's a circle on the outside of it, another circle on the outside of it. That's like the operating system. The operating system communicates with the hardware, but then it also has software that runs on top of it. and it communicates through the hardware with drivers and things like that. Well, for the operating system to function, it runs off of what's called a kernel. The kernel is the operating instructions for the operating systems. So the applications that you use every day, email, whatever you're using, Microsoft Word or what have you, that's at the outer circle. That's on the top or the outside of the operating system. We're going through that circle down into the operating system, and right before you get to essentially the hardware, basically, to simplify this. So the kernel, that has absolute unquestioned authority over the hardware, the memory, every process running on the machine. That's essentially the machine language right there. So if a threat actor gets malicious code running on that kernel, it means game over. They have full control over the computer. The malware can look down at your EDR software and simply order it to stop running. And the EDR, that's the endpoint detection response, it has no choice but to obey. That's like the operating system. That's like the operating system. Okay, we're going to stop the service, basically, because the operating system has control over everything. And it won't even throw an alert for the security operations center because it just looks like a computer rebooting or something. So it actually doesn't even look like a computer rebooting. It looks like an authorized command to turn it off from an authorized user.
And that is exactly what makes this attack so terrifying in a modern enterprise environment. Microsoft knows how dangerous kernel access is. That is why modern systems like Windows 11 rely on secure boot, TPM chips, and strict driver signature enforcement. Windows is fundamentally programmed to reject any kernel driver that hasn't been cryptographically signed and vetted by Microsoft's hardware compatibility publisher. So how did the attackers bypass that? They didn't exploit a vulnerability in a legitimate driver, which is a common tactic known as bring your own vulnerable driver. Instead, as InfoSecurity Magazine and Security.com highlighted, the attackers actually managed to trick Microsoft into signing the malicious PoisonX driver itself. To the Windows operating system, this malware looks like a completely legitimate Microsoft-approved piece of hardware software.
And this means that TPM and your secure boot won't stop it. So all that work that you did to get a computer that would even run Windows 11 doesn't even matter. All that work that they put into making sure that Windows 11 wouldn't be installed on a machine without TPM or without the secure boot option doesn't even matter in this case. Because the exploit walks right past the bouncer, basically, of the nightclub with VIP credentials, just like as if they're the most secure application on the computer. But let's make this real for our OT professionals, like the people who are defending critical infrastructure. You might think, okay, my plant floor is air-gapped. And we talk about how that's a figment of your imagination all the time. But even so, what about all these remote support folks? Like there are some organizations out there today who still use third parties because they have to. They use third parties to support their equipment. And those third-party contractors or consultants or support personnel, they stay at hotels. And sometimes they use the hotel Wi-Fi to make their updates or to do their work. Now, hopefully they have VPNs, but not always. So what if they're at the hotel? Let's say it's been a long day working. They have to go back the next day. They're checking out their social media, whatever on their PC. And the attacker drops something like AnyDesk. Symantec noted this was hidden in a music folder during an attack, basically. Then they drop a PoisonX driver. Because the driver is signed by Microsoft, the corporate EDR on that laptop goes completely blind. So the attacker then waits for the engineer to VPN into their corporate network. And once they're in that environment, they ride that connection right on in to the plant floor, and they're completely undetected. So it's like, okay, something happened. It discovered it, and then the real exploit was actually the real payload was actually in the background. That real payload was that PoisonX driver. And because it was signed by Microsoft, it was just installed without a problem. And then once that software was on there, as soon as you use that laptop to connect to that network remotely, it has a connection to that network.
And Dennis, if we tie this back to our previous segment on the Jade Puffer AI ransomware, the threat landscape becomes truly chilling. Imagine combining these two tactics. You have an agentic AI moving at machine speed, actively reasoning through network defenses. But instead of just stealing credentials, the AI autonomously drops a Microsoft-signed kernel driver to instantly execute EDR on the host. You have a threat that moves faster than a human can react and leaves absolutely no telemetry for your automated SOAR playbooks to trigger on. It's a ghost in the machine.
And that is that nightmare scenario that I was bringing up earlier. So if your EDR is blinded at the kernel level, you cannot rely on that endpoint protection. It's not going to do you any good. You have to rely on behavior analytics on the network. You have to rely on segmentation to stop things from happening. If the host suddenly stops sending EDR logs, but the switch port shows it's still passing traffic, so it didn't just disconnect, that host must be automatically quarantined. It has to be both of those things. It has to be checking for that type of behavior. That's what we mean by behavior analytics. Zero trust architecture isn't just about identity here as well. It's not just about the people logging in. It's about verifying the integrity of the endpoint and continuously verifying. So in a zero trust environment, you have a subject, and a subject logs in using their asset to an enterprise resource. So if the subject meets all the checks, they can log into their asset. If the asset meets all the checks, they can get to the enterprise resource, like even connecting to the network, like the VPN. But if the asset doesn't meet all the checks, like in this case, we're saying the behavior is wrong, it should be quarantined immediately. And that's what that laptop is. That's that asset. So on that sober note, that's all the time we have for today's episode. A big thank you to all of you listeners out there. Thank you for tuning in week after week, sticking with me. I really appreciate that as I build this thing that I am trying to build. And also thanks for all the researchers from Security Week, Bleeping Computers, Sysdig, Symantec, the HIPAA Journal, and everyone else who contributed to the intelligence we covered today. And I'm going to tell you thank you, even though I know you don't care, but thank you, Gemini, for helping me host.
It was a pleasure, Dennis. Stay secure, everyone.
Okay, and this has been another CyberSecureOT podcast. We will see you next time. Thank you.